When We Disagree is a show about arguments, how we have them, why we have them, and their impact on our relationships and ourselves. Let's start with a big, abstract question. Where do we argue? I mean, as a public, as a nation, as a people, where do we argue? It's one thing to ask what we argue about: elections, taxes, wars, fracking, pronouns, and more. It's another thing to ask how we argue, angrily, with lots of name-calling, uncharitably, loudly, not at all, and more. But where do we do this business of arguing? And arguing, to be clear, is the business of democracy. It is the means of democracy. That's vital as well. Where we do the business of arguing is vital. This where we argue question concerns what many people call the public sphere. The public sphere is the place or places where the community debates about its own interests. Classically, one might think of the Constitutional Convention as a vital and original example of the American public sphere, or perhaps even a jury debating about the facts of a case as a smaller example. But since we all can't be in Congress or on juries, where else do we argue? One answer is that we argue in lots of places: schools, bars, courthouses, parking lots, and on privately owned social media channels. And then another answer to this question is that we argue in so many places, and these arguments take place all around us, that public argument is really watered down, fragmented. It's largely unavailable to most of us. And it's accidental. And this space, public space for the public to debate about itself, is really important. The public becomes a public through public knowledge, public space to debate, and then actual public arguments between ourselves. In other words, minus these, a public is really just a bunch of private, separate witnesses to the world unfolding around us. I'm Michael Lee, Professor of Communication and Director of the Civility Initiative at the College of Charleston. Our guest today on When We Disagree is Jamelle Bouie. He's a columnist at the New York Times. Jamelle, tell us an argument story.
Tell you an argument story. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's funny, in my personal life, I'm very consensus driven. I'm a very big believer in like deliberation when it comes to making, say, family decisions, when it comes to doing all that kind of stuff. And so I wouldn't say I'm conflict avoidant when it comes to like my personal life, but just sort of like I feel it's much more useful to kind of, we'll discuss and then we'll come to some sort of agreed upon solution. In my professional life, however, it's all about making arguments. My professional life is centered on and around making arguments, making claims, collecting evidence and doing that sort of thing. And so I'd say my argument story is kind of, in a lot of ways, the story of like my own like intellectual development since not the last presidential election, but the one before that, 2016, when I came into that election, very much a product of the Obama era, with a set of assumptions about what the American electorate was, about how American politics operated, about what wins and what loses, and came out of that election with all of those things very clearly being wrong. But the thing is that in the moment, I don't think I was willing to admit that they were wrong. You develop your own attachments to the things that you believe, to the conclusions you've come to, and it's a very difficult thing to let go of that. And so I would say that for some time after that election, I was engaged in this like long running and like heated argument with people through text, through other medium about what happened in 2016, about why that election went the way that it did, about what is the proper emphasis going forward for thinking about a certain kind of politics. And I was very much, for a while, like very much set in my ways about this, and a little intransigent, sort of like, no, this was, very simply, an election about racial prejudice. This was very simply, a backlash to Obama in like the crudest possible ways, et cetera, et cetera. And it is not so much that I had that I was like persuaded by my interlocutors. I'll say this,
Okay.
and not so much that I had some great revelation. What happened? How this argument resolved, and we'll sort of the synthesis I've come to in the years since is I became part of it's a little bit of ego. I like being right. I like being right quite a bit. And as the data and research and study of the 2016 election came through from political scientists, from demographers, from the people whose job it is really to try to analyze this dispassionately, a few things became clear. Some of the claims that the people who disagreed with were wrong, but some of the claims I was making were wrong as well. When it came to, who voted, when it came to their motivations for voting, when it came to lots of things. And so because I'm someone who has always prided myself on taking data seriously, and taking empirical work seriously, empirical work that is challenging some of my assumptions. It's empirical work that really has to be grappled with. As that is, ongoing, I am also sort of redirecting my reading in U.S. history away from sort of like 20th century stuff to more like 19th century history, and trying to build out sort of maybe a more broader and in-depth understanding of political change in the country and of the kind of forces that might drive political change.
Let me jump in and ask you a question about, I actually want to go to the beginning. You made a distinction about how you show up in your personal life versus how you show up in your professional life.
Yeah.
You say that you're very consensus driven and pro deliberation in your personal life. I'm not hearing much other than a search for greater understanding that really assembles all of the potential competing variables about something complicated like the 2016 election. So going back to the distinction,
Right.
I'm not hearing much of a difference there.
I think the difference is that I would never say to someone in my personal life, well, I think you're wrong about this.
Okay.
And try to be argumentative with them, try to sort of like say here's X, Y, Z in like a very logical and ordered way why I think that you're incorrect about this. Like that's not a way I would like talk to a person that
even if I was wrong,
even if you were wrong, right? Like even if I thought that you were mistaken.
If you and I are in a car and we're driving somewhere and I'm insistent on going on this highway and for a fact that that's not the case.
Right. In that kind of scenario, I might say something like, well, we'll just keep on going for a little bit and we'll see if we're on the right path. We should be passing this if we're on the right path. And if we aren't, like we should consider, turning around.
So you would make it into kind of an experiment, and then the evidence that the experiment was failing, from my point of view about directions, would become so self-evident that I would have to change my mind.
That would be my hope, right?
And then there's a similar process going on in your writing too, which is there are long-term historical forces that help us explain Trump from the 19th century to the present. You're changing your own mind. In other words, you ran an experiment. You were resistant, as we all are, because we're ego invested in our conclusions. But you ran an experiment about a limited conclusion you had made about 2016 that you have now revised somewhat. Maybe you weren't persuaded, but you've come to a different synthesis.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's a good summary. And I would say that the distinction for me in my mind, in my experience, is that the professional thing happens through a much more sort of like, there's much more conflict involved.
The difference is almost rhetorical.
Right.
You would not say, if you and I disagree about, let's say, the build up to the Civil War, you would say, no, I think you're wrong.
Yes.
Period.
Yeah.
Here's why.
Right.
If you and I are having directions, or if we are members of a family or something, or disagreeing about what to serve at Thanksgiving, it's a little bit more subtle.
The extent to which I'm in like a sustained relationship with a person. Like if I'm arguing with someone, like another commentator at a magazine, it's like I'm not going to be mean to someone. That's different. But I'm not like in the kind of relationship where there's going to be ongoing give and take, where there has to be trust built, where there has to be, where we have to see each other every day and like feelings can be hurt and things can be carried for a long time. And I'm like very sensitive to those sorts of things. But if it's sort of like it's like playing playing on a serious football team or basketball team versus like playing street ball with your friends, right? It's like when you're playing street ball with your friends, you're competitive, obviously.
Yeah.
But like there are things you will not do with your friends when you're just like kind of playing around that you might do if you were playing on a court for real stakes.
Sure. What I'm struck by something that's happening, which is we've had dozens of guests on the show, and so I've run across at least two different types. One is a person who says exactly what you're saying, which is that my professional life is in some sense devoted to being antagonistic. I make arguments. Maybe they're lawyers, maybe they're professors, maybe they just are people who like to argue with strangers.
I mean, I'm sure all of that liking arguing with strangers is almost certainly a part of every profession you just mentioned.
And then second, those same arguing with strangers people come home and are pretty conciliatory, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
But then there's others, and we seldom get folks who identify this way, but I've certainly seen it, where they're actually deeply conciliatory to preserve more anonymous, loose tie relationships, but can be incredibly harsh on the people closest to them. It sounds like you were opting way more for the former strategy than the latter strategy.
Yes. It's not that when it comes to personal relationships, I'm conflict avoidant necessarily. Sometimes there has to be conflict, but even that I think has to be structured a certain way, right? Like this is what I say to my kids, that even when we're upset with each other or mad with each other, there are things that we're not going to do. We're not going to yell at each other. We're not going to, say mean things. If we need to take a break, we'll take a break and gather our thoughts. And it's still important to voice those thoughts with clarity. If my wife and I have a disagreement about something, it's important that we say that clearly, unambiguously, and work through the disagreement, work through the conflict.
Yeah.
But I'm a believer when it comes to that sort of thing in structuring, like the structure in which you approach a conflict matters as much as like the substance of the conflict itself.
Well, that's good.
And I've certainly observed people who have like minor conflicts and disagreements in a personal life, but they're they approach them with a lot of high drama, and it becomes that more than even the conflict itself becomes the issue.
Yeah. Yeah. The conflict about conflict.
Right.
Right. I don't want to get back to 2016 in just a second, but I'm enjoying this for a moment.
We can stay here.
Okay. We'll stay here for a moment, but I am curious to hear about your evolutions, places you thought you were right and wrong, and certainly as it applies to the present. But second, it sounds at least like you have an investment in structure as it pertains to, let's say, familial, social, personal, home life settings. But it also sounds like you have kind of a tacit theory of how civility or norms of decorum change depending on the relationship, which is to say that you have one set of, it's not like you're uncivil or mean in your professional life as a writer, columnist, but the things that you would say follow under a very different framework of civility and structure. So talk about those two things, right?
Right. I think when it comes to the making arguments in the public, I think that what maybe civility demands of us is honesty, it's truthfulness, it's forthrightness, it's not being disingenuous or intellectually dishonest. But I don't think in that circumstance, civility demands a kind of conciliatory gesture, right? Because I'm not conciliatory here. Like especially if it's on something of where there are real stakes, where we're arguing about something, we're discussing something for which the consequences are quite great. I don't think there's any particular requirement to say, at the end of the day, we can all be friends. Maybe we can't. Our strong feelings towards each other are totally legitimate. That does not mean that we essentially like cut intellectual corners. Mm-hmm. And to me, like civility in that context is sort of like, I'm going to show you basically the decency and courtesy to say what I mean and say it honestly and truthfully.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna, I'm not going to try to lie to you or deceive you. That's what I owe you. But I don't necessarily owe the kind of caring consideration I might show to my brother when we are disagreeing about something.
And there are moments here where I'm reminded of a concept in some of the democracy literature of forbearance, right? Or pulling punches, as it were. And there's a theorist who wrote a lovely book called Mere Civility, Teresa Bejan, and she talks about civility as not pulling punches, but not necessarily trying to land all of them at the same time.
That's right.
And that seems to apply in both contexts of this kind of like public-private split that we're teasing out as the way that you engage in conflict. I am curious, though, about the idea about stakes, because in some sense, the stakes of a personal relationship have a far more immediate and personal and, frankly, controllable context than does anything you or I ever say about, let's say, the build up to the Civil War.
Right. This might be like my understanding of stakes here might be a bit of a function of just like my job here. It's like, I work for the single largest newspaper in the United States. I have like kind of unlimited space to do whatever I want on maybe the most read opinion page in the United States. And so arguments about, public policy, arguments about even the basis for a political movement or not, do actually have like influential people will read this stuff and come to their own conclusions. And there's like stakes in trying to like influence them the way that I want to be, and I want them to be influenced. And so when I think of like the stakes of an argument, like that to me, is what they are. Like this is this thing from like, you're on social media and you're arguing with something. Yeah, that's just pleasure, right? There's no real stakes there.
There's visibility here. That's the difference.
Right.
Massive visibility. And the pressure of that visibility to argue in a particular way, to demonstrate norms of decorum, norms of argumentative exchange, given your visibility, you're very thoughtful about that, and they're fundamentally different from. So I guess why, if the goal is to be visible and of course influential, right? You want people to take your ideas very seriously. What is it about your theory of public persuasion that indicates to you that a less conciliatory, more didactic, deductive, here is my claim, here is the evidence, therefore you are wrong approach is more persuasive than the other one?
I think that part of it, I'll say, it's just how my brain operates. Like in terms of, I almost became a lawyer, right? Sort of like I almost went to law school and became a lawyer. I think it's just sort of like a natural way that like I think I just construct arguments.
Same for the record.
But I also think this might sound a little counterintuitive, but I think that in the world of opinion journalism and opinion argument making, there actually isn't enough forthrightness. There isn't enough people just saying what they mean. There's a lot of trying to subtly influence. And I think I don't know, I think there's more, for me, there's more value in just like saying the thing and not trying to negotiate around it. I'm trying to think of an example that isn't too inflammatory, but one example that is maybe a little bit inflammatory is that there was, after the 2020 election, a big discussion in sort of like center-left, centrist Democratic spaces about sort of the way forward. How do you appeal to these voters that you may be losing? And one perspective was, Democrats need to moderate on cultural issues. They need to moderate maybe on economic issues, like speak more of a language that appeals to the working class voters that they're losing, stay away from cultural radicalism. And as I followed this, I was like, I don't know what any of this means. Like, what does it mean? What does this mean in practice? Like, who are the specific groups of people that you think should be distanced from?
Sure.
What are the specific ideas, figures, politicians that you think need to be set aside?
Yeah.
I would rather, and when I engaged in this, I didn't have a prescription, but I sort of said, in 1992, when Bill Clinton was trying to do something similar, he specifically went after the Black Left. He went after Jesse Jackson. He went after Sister Souljah. He
Yeah.
specifically said, these are the people who are alienating us from the mainstream voters, and we're going to condemn them
That's right.
specifically. And a lot of people didn't like it. A lot of people loved it. But that's the kind of claim I need you to make, right? Like you can't just say distance yourself from the cultural left. Who?
Uh-huh.
And which people and which groups, and like own the fact that you want to make a strategic decision that might leave some people behind because you think there's a greater good in front of you. And I think that's what I mean when I say I prefer, like that's, and I as I think about what I wrote and how I wrote it,
Uh-huh.
it was not, it was in the very much in the tone that I'm saying it now. It was not, it was, I used an historical example. I used an example to illustrate exactly what I think people are talking about. And then I said to them, be explicit and don't beat around the bush.
Yeah.
And this, I mean, this gets back, I actually think this gets back to the structure thing. Like this is a much more useful structure for discussing these things than vague intonations about, broad categories that can be defined any way you want them to.
Yeah, this reminds me a bit of Orwell's Politics in the English Language, which is just about accountability, right? Clarity and accountability.
I think that those are the two things that I care a lot about, like clarity and accountability. Like we should be accountable for the things that we say, and we should write in a way to make it easier to hold us accountable for the things that we say. And I'm kind of naturally distrustful of approaches to argument that try to weasel out of accountability, that try to leave it open so that anyone can believe whatever they want about what you're saying.
Yeah. What is the argument? What evidence do you have to support that argument? And then let's test that.
Right.
Is the claim supported by the evidence? Is there a warrant to connect the evidence to the claim, and so forth? And I prefer that style of argument too, coming from a kind of wannabe legal debate, academic background, et cetera. And I also can recognize that that's a style of argument that I prefer.
Yes.
But I don't necessarily have any evidence that is persuasive in the public sphere. And so that's what I was trying to get at. As we can have our preferences, but if your goal is influence, is this influential in the way that you think? Versus if you could engage in more of a kind of subterfuge, illusion, elliptical style of argument, and it led you to greater policy influence, what would you do?
I would find that very off-putting. I don't know if my preferred approach is the most persuasive. Okay. I know that it works for me. It fits my sensibilities. I think that it can be persuasive for some people.
Yeah.
But
well said. And to that point, to connect back to the kind of original argument story you were telling, you were talking about a time in which you were not necessarily persuaded by specific people with specific arguments, but in this process of give and take over the 2016 election that led to your greater readings on American history, not so narrowly focused on the Obama era, that you were persuaded and that you did, at least to yourself, if not in public, admit that you were wrong on certain things.
Right.
What were some of those things, and talk about that process?
I'd say the big thing that I was wrong on, and I've not yet written about this most recent election, but you can you'll very quick, it'll be like a clear difference.
Sure.
And after 2016, I think I wrote, these people are all racist, and we got to write them off. That's all that's going on here.
That was the 65 or however many million votes he got.
Right. That's that. Okay. That's that. And this time, what I plan to write is to say, a lot of people voted for him for a bunch of different reasons. Some of those reasons are probably terrible, but a lot of people voted for him for completely reasonable and rational reasons, and that should structure how, if you were an opponent of Trump, how you should move forward. And we should break down what those reasons are and try to figure out, not necessarily if we're going to be able to appeal on the same level, but to sort of think strategically about how one responds to the new administration, given the diversity of reasons for people choosing something. Another way to put this is that I've gone from thinking of electorates as being one singular thing and thinking of electorates as being almost sort of like they are highly contingent and amorphous and in some sense mysterious things that we project meaning onto, and that we should be careful about the meanings we project on them, because those meanings will structure how we move forward after the fact.
It sounds a little bit like and this is a word you use that I found interesting, but talking to Jamel after the 24 election and then hearing you talk about Jamel after the 16 election, you've got a hammer and you've got a lot of nails in front of you and you're going to hit them.
Yeah.
This time you have a much more careful, nuanced conclusion about the multiple contradictory coalitions that comprise a massive electorate. And we need to understand those points of view that are not one point of view, but multiple, which sounds, to go back to the earlier split between public and private.
It sounds much more like how I approach things in private.
Rather conciliatory.
Yeah. But I wouldn't say, I don't know. It's funny because am I conciliatory about, now I'm just going to get into my own politics. Am I conciliatory about the 71.6 million Americans who like decided to put Trump back in the White House? I don't know if I'm conciliatory. I don't like that they did it. I think they made a bad choice. I think it's a bad choice that will have a lot of negative repercussions for many Americans. But I think maybe the distinction is that after 2016, I was like, these are bad people. And now I'm saying they made a bad choice.
Oh, and that's shame and guilt, right? But also the difference in terms of conciliation, we don't need to get super semantic on the word, but conciliatory, I was hearing you say, I want to understand people for the reasons they said they did a thing,
right,
as opposed to ascribing a motivation to them that they might not accept.
Right.
And that is a very conciliatory way of viewing the world and relationships, that you might sustain relationships that with folks you have to see on a day-to-day basis in your family, but also might sustain relationships with broader citizens with whom you have a fundamental disagreement.
Right. I think when I think about my sort of growth and change over 8 years, some of this is, I think, just, I mean, you don't naturally do anything as you get older, but for me, I think part of this is just like getting older. And I have kids now, and it's like my life is just different in these very fundamental ways. It's sort of like require kind of a different way of approaching the world. But part of it is, my actual intellectual development, just sort of like a real serious engagement in sort of like what is democracy? What is democratic life? Like, what do these things mean? Like, what are we trying to construct and build here? What does it require of us? What does being a citizen require of us? And it's sort of taking all of that seriously, I think, has led me to this kind of perspective I have now, which you're describing as a conciliatory perspective about political outcomes, which is a certain amount of humility about what one can actually know.
What is knowable.
Right.
And with what certainty.
Right. And a certain amount of curiosity about what other people are doing and how they understand themselves and understand their world. And also a certain level of, what I'm not going to be, I'm not a political strategist. I'm not going to like be governing how, what Democrats do. So it's part of it's just like, now I'm just thinking about what do I want to know?
Right.
Separate and apart from whether it's instrumentally useful to anyone.
Yeah. Let me close on a kind of historical question that bleeds into the future here. Could 2016 Jamel see this Jamel coming? And then second, what Jamel do you see giving a podcast interview like this one after the 2032 election?
Could 2016 Jamel see this Jamel coming? I don't, that's a good question. I don't know if he could.
Yeah.
Again, it's like experiences change it. I don't know. 8 years from now, I have a feeling that 8 years from now, whatever distinction exists in my like personal and private approach to conflict will maybe have disintegrated completely. In part because a very good friend of mine who is also a writer, has long believed in sort of like a stable and fulfilling personal life is sort of integral to developing a vibrant professional one that you can't really explore if you are constantly trying to build an actual foundation for like your day-to-day life. And I think he's right. And I think because I think he's right, I can see that I can see a future Jamel being even more conciliatory and the like, in part because in that 8 years, I hope to continue to focus on, building out a strong and steady foundation, like with my family, with my community, with the people around me, and using the stability of my day-to-day life as the foundation for maybe thinking more expansively and broadly and creatively about the world around me. Yeah.
Well said. Jamel Bowie, thanks so much for being on When We Disagree.
Thank you for having me.
When We Disagree is recorded at the College of Charleston with creator and host Michael Lee. Recording and sound engineering by Jesse Kunz and Lance Laidlaw. Reach out to us at whenwedisagree@gmail.com.